A photograph sits in the National Archives. Taken in 1858, somewhere in the Florida swamps. 3 men stand at the edge of a cypress grove. 2 are U.S. Army officers in full uniform. The third is barefoot, shirtless, wrapped in a patchwork cloth that catches the light. He is not in chains. He is not kneeling. He is looking directly at the camera with an expression that has no name in English. The United States Army had been trying to remove this man's people for 30 years. They failed. In 1842, after 7 years of the bloodiest guerrilla war ever fought on American soil, the United States government did something it almost never did. It stopped. It declared the conflict over, not because it had won, it hadn't, but because it could not win. The Seminole had retreated into the deep Everglades, a landscape so hostile that American soldiers were dying of fever and exhaustion faster than they were dying in combat. The government called it a peace agreement. The Seminole called it nothing at all because they never signed it. They were never conquered. That is not a legend or a political slogan. It is a historical and legal fact. No treaty of surrender exists. No formal capitulation. No moment where the Seminole people laid down their arms and accepted American authority over their territory. The United States fought 3 separate wars against them, 1817, 1835, 1855, and lost all 3. Today, the Seminole tribe of Florida maintains this distinction officially. They call themselves the unconquered people. But here's where the story gets complicated, because when you ask the question, who exactly were the Seminole, the answer starts to fracture. The name itself is not ancient. The identity is not ancient. And the DNA evidence collected over the last 2 decades from living Seminole descendants and from archaeological remains across the Florida Peninsula reveals something that neither the government's version of history nor the tribe's own origin stories fully prepared anyone to find. The Seminole, as a people, did not exist before roughly 1715. Let that sit for a moment. Not because they weren't there, not because the land was empty, but because the group we call the Seminole was assembled, consciously, deliberately, over generations, from fragments of peoples who survived catastrophes that almost no one survived. The DNA doesn't show one ancestral line. It shows several. Some of those lines go back 12,000 years in Florida soil. Others traveled hundreds of miles from the north in the span of a single generation. And one of those lines, a small but unmistakable haplogroup cluster, connects to a population that has no clean explanation yet. That is what we're here to investigate. To understand why the Seminole were unconquerable, you have to understand what they were made of. Not culturally, not politically, genetically. Because the biology and the history point to the same conclusion. This was not a people who fought hard because they had strong leaders or favorable terrain, though both were true. They fought hard because they had already survived things that should have killed them, multiple times, across multiple centuries. The Seminole resistance was not a military story. It was a survival story that had been running for 10,000 years before the first American soldier set foot in Florida. But the official version of history doesn't start there. It starts with the Creek. The standard textbook account goes like this. The Seminole were Creek Indians, who migrated south into Florida in the early 1700s after the indigenous Florida tribes, the Calusa, the Timucua, the Appalachians, had been largely wiped out by Spanish colonization and English raids. The word Seminole itself is usually traced to a Spanish adaptation of a Creek word meaning something like wild, or runaway, or those who camp at a distance. The story is tidy. Creek Indians moved south, they became the Seminole, then the Americans tried to move them back north to Oklahoma, and the Seminole said no. That version is not wrong exactly, but it is incomplete in ways that change everything. In the Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History, there is a collection of skeletal remains recovered from a site called Wendover in Brevard County, Florida. The remains are approximately 8,000 years old. They were found in a peat bog that preserved not just bone, but soft tissue, and in some cases, brain matter. This is extraordinary. Brain tissue from 8,000 years ago is almost unheard of in North America. What makes the Wendover site directly relevant to the Seminole story is what happened when researchers extracted mitochondrial DNA from those remains. The haplogroups they found, the maternal lineage markers, overlap with haplogroups found in living members of the Seminole tribe of Florida. Not all of them, but some, which means some of the people who call themselves Seminole today carry genetic markers that connect them to people who were living in Florida 8,000 years before the Creek migration ever happened. 8,000 years. That is not a migration story. That is a deep roots story. And it raises a question that the standard textbook account cannot answer. If the Seminole were just transplanted Creek, why do some of them carry DNA that has been in Florida since the last ice age? Ask yourself this. What does it mean to be a people? Is it a shared language? The Seminole speak two languages, Muskogee and Miccosukee, and they are distinct enough that speakers of one cannot always understand speakers of the other. Is it shared ancestry? We just established that the ancestry is layered. Some of it ancient Florida, some of it recent Creek. Is it shared history? The Seminole were assembled partly from African Americans who escaped slavery and found refuge in Seminole communities, becoming what historians call Black Seminoles, whose descendants today have their own complex legal and identity claims. The Seminole are not one blood. They never were, and that is not a weakness in the story. It is the story. Because what the DNA evidence, the linguistic record, and the archaeological record all point toward, when you put them together, is that the Seminole were not a tribe that migrated south and happened to survive. They were a coalescence, a gathering, a people built specifically to survive, assembled from the most resilient fragments of multiple collapsed populations, in a landscape that the United States government would eventually discover it could not conquer. The swamp didn't protect them. They were made for the swamp. The official story has a beginning, a middle, and a problem. The beginning is clean. Florida's original inhabitants, the Calusa in the south, the Timucua in the center and north, the Appalachian in the northwest, were effectively destroyed by the early 1700s. Spanish missionaries and English slavers operating out of Carolina had spent decades raiding indigenous villages, capturing people for the slave trade, and spreading diseases against which no population had any immunity. By 1710, some estimates suggest that more than 90% of Florida's pre-contact indigenous population was gone. The peninsula was, in demographic terms, nearly empty. Into that emptiness came the Creek. The Creek Confederacy, a loose alliance of related tribes centered in what is now Alabama and Georgia, was under its own pressure from English colonists. Some groups began moving south. They found Florida open, they moved in. The Spanish, who still controlled Florida at the time, encouraged this, because the Creek settlers served as a buffer against English expansion. The Spanish called these southern migrants by a term that stuck, cimarrones, meaning something like wild ones or those who live apart. The Creek adapted the word into their own language. It became Seminole. The middle is also clean. The Seminole established towns across northern Florida, developed a distinct culture that mixed Creek traditions with adaptations to the Florida environment. And by the time American settlers began pressing into the territory in the early 1800s, the Seminole were a recognized sovereign nation with established territory and significant population. Then Andrew Jackson happened. The First Seminole War, 1817 to 1818, was nominally a border dispute. Jackson crossed into Spanish Florida pursuing escaped slaves and Creek warriors who had been raiding American settlements. The Second Seminole War, beginning in 1835, was the Removal War. The U.S. government wanted the Seminole gone, relocated to Indian Territory in Oklahoma under the Indian Removal Act. The Third Seminole War, 1855 to 1858, was a final attempt to clear out the holdouts who had retreated into the Everglades. All three failed to achieve complete removal. Somewhere between 300 and 500 Seminole remained hidden in the Everglades at the end of the Third War. They were never formally removed. They were never formally surrendered. Their descendants are the Seminole tribe of Florida today and the Miccosukee tribe of Indians, a separate, federally recognized entity that split from the Seminole tribe in 1962. That is the official story, and it is, broadly speaking, accurate. Here is the first crack. The word Seminole was not a Creek word that meant those who moved south. Linguistic analysis of the term's actual origins is messier than the textbook version suggests. The root word in Creek, Isti Simanole, is usually translated as wild men or free people, but the Creek term itself appears to be borrowed from a Spanish term, which was itself possibly borrowed from an earlier usage. The word has been traced by some researchers to a Muskogean root that predates the Creek migration south, which would mean the word Seminole, or its conceptual ancestor, may have been in use in the Florida region before the people we call the Seminole arrived. That is a small detail, but small details matter in an investigation like this. Because if the name predates the migration, then the identity predates the migration. And if the identity predates the migration, then the Creek didn't create the Seminole. They joined something that was already forming. Here is the second crack, and it is larger. The historical record of Florida in the late 1600s and early 1700s is not as empty as the standard story requires. Spanish mission records, English colonial documents, and the journals of early explorers all describe indigenous people in Florida during the period when Florida was supposed to be depopulated. These were not large populations, they were remnants, survivors of the disease waves, the slave raids, the colonial violence. Small groups hiding in coastal marshes, river systems, hammock islands deep in the interior. They didn't disappear, they went underground. And when the Creek migrants moved south and began establishing towns, some of those remnant Florida populations, Calusa descendants, Timucua survivors, smaller groups with no recorded names, appeared to have integrated into the new communities. Not fully, not cleanly, but the genetic and archaeological evidence suggests they didn't just vanish, they merged. Which means the Seminole, from their earliest formation, were already a composite people. A missionary's report from 1703, written by a Spanish Franciscan friar operating out of St. Augustine, describes a village on the Suwannee River inhabited by people he calls apostates, former mission converts who had rejected Christianity and returned to traditional practices. He notes almost in passing that the village contains people who speak at least 3 different languages, including one he does not recognize. He guesses it might be a southern dialect of Timucua, which by that point was supposedly nearly extinct. That report sat in the archive of the Indies in Seville for nearly 300 years before a historian at the University of Florida pulled it and realized what it might mean. A village in 1703 with Timucua speakers, people who should not have been there, people the history books said were gone, not gone, hiding, surviving, waiting. But here is where we have to step back and reframe the question entirely. The standard history asks, where did the Seminole come from? That is the wrong question. The right question is, was there something in Florida, a population, a tradition, a persistent human presence that endured across the catastrophes of colonization, and that the Creek migrants encountered and absorbed when they moved south? Because if the answer is yes, then the Seminole are not a Creek tribe that moved to Florida. They are something older, something layered. A people with Creek culture on top and ancient Florida roots underneath, assembled by catastrophe and survival over not decades, but centuries. Florida is not a state. Geologically speaking, Florida is a limestone platform sitting on top of an ancient seafloor, rising and falling with the ice ages, sometimes twice its current size, sometimes nearly submerged. During the last glacial maximum, roughly 20,000 years ago, Florida was significantly larger. Its coastline extended dozens of miles further into what is now the Gulf of Mexico and the Atlantic Ocean. It was drier, cooler, and dotted with freshwater springs that emerged from the underlying aquifer. It looked nothing like it looks today, and people were living there. The earliest confirmed human presence in Florida dates to approximately 14,000 years ago, based on stone tools and bone fragments recovered from multiple sites. These were not the ancestors of any specific modern tribe. They were Paleo-Indians, the first wave of humans moving through the Americas following the retreat of the glaciers. They were hunters following megafauna, mastodons, giant ground sloths, ancient horses, and camels that no longer exist in North America. What happened to those earliest Floridians is one of the great mysteries of North American archaeology. By roughly 10,000 years ago, the megafauna were extinct. The climate was warming. The coast was rising as the glaciers melted and sea levels climbed. The Florida that Paleo-Indians had known, open savanna, broad plains, a landscape more like East Africa than the subtropics, was transforming into something wetter, warmer, and more heavily forested. The ecological conditions that had supported a certain way of life were gone. And yet, people remained. This is the first critical layer. The Paleo-Indian population of Florida did not simply walk away when conditions changed. They adapted. Archaeological evidence shows a transition in tool types, in subsistence strategies, in settlement patterns that indicates continuity of human occupation even as the environment transformed dramatically. They moved toward the coasts, toward the rivers, toward the spring systems that remained reliable freshwater sources even as the landscape shifted around them. They became the archaic Floridians. The Windover site, the peat bog in Brevard County, is Archaic period, approximately 7,000 to 8,000 years old. And what the researchers who excavated Windover found was not a primitive people struggling to survive a changing world. They found a sophisticated community. The dead were buried carefully, wrapped in fabric woven from plant fibers, placed in the water of the bog deliberately. They had dental care, evidence of plant-based treatments for tooth decay. They had a burial ritual complex enough to suggest organized religious practice. And the DNA from their remains, extracted in research published in the early 2010s, shows mitochondrial haplogroups, particularly haplogroup X2A and haplogroup C, that appear in living indigenous populations across eastern North America, including some living Seminole descendants. 8,000 years of continuity. Not perfect continuity. Populations moved, mixed, fragmented, but the signal is there. Ancient Florida was not a place people passed through. It was a place people settled, rooted, and built a way of life so durable that traces of it survive in blood today. A new cultural pattern emerges in the archaeological record of the Florida Gulf Coast around 3,000 years ago, centered on the construction of large shell midden mounds and elaborate ceremonial sites. This is the beginning of what archaeologists call the Weeden Island culture, and later the Safety Harbor culture, the cultural tradition directly ancestral to the historical Calusa and their neighbors in South and Central Florida. The Calusa are worth understanding because they are underestimated. When Europeans first encountered the Calusa in the early 1500s, they found a non-agricultural society that had nevertheless built a complex, stratified civilization. The Calusa did not farm. They fished. They harvested shellfish, sea turtles, manatees, deer, and a spectacular variety of plant foods available in the subtropical environment. And they were not small. Estimates of the Calusa population at the time of European contact range from 10,000 to as high as 50,000 people. Enough to build large towns, maintain a ruling class, wage war against their neighbors, and resist Spanish conversion efforts for nearly 2 centuries. The Spanish never conquered the Calusa either. The Calusa resisted Spanish missionaries with a consistency that frustrated every colonial governor in St. Augustine. They killed missionaries, they killed soldiers, they negotiated, accepted gifts, then rejected Christianity and returned to their own religious practices. The last major Calusa community disbanded not because of military defeat, but because of accumulated disease loss and the destruction of their trading networks. Somewhere around 1750, the remaining Calusa either died, merged with Cuban fishing communities in the Keys, or retreated further south into the Everglades and survived in small groups. Now hold the ancient archaic Floridians and the Calusa and their Safety Harbor cultural tradition and add the layer everyone knows, the Creek migration. Beginning roughly 1715, following the catastrophic Yamasee War, which shattered the Creek Confederacy and sent many of its member groups fleeing in multiple directions. Some went north, some went west. A significant number went south, into the near-empty northern Florida, finding the towns abandoned, the land available, the Spanish willing to accommodate them. They brought with them the Muskogean languages, Muskogee and Hitchiti, which would develop into the Miccosukee spoken by some Seminole today. They brought the green corn ceremony, the clan system, the specific political structure of the Creek towns. They built new towns in northern Florida and called themselves Seminole, or allowed others to call them that. But they did not find Florida empty. A 2019 paper in the American Journal of Human Genetics examined mitochondrial DNA from archaeological remains at 16 sites across Florida, spanning from the Archaic period through the Contact period. The researchers were looking for evidence of population continuity versus replacement. What they found was not a clean break. At several sites in Central and South Florida, the same haplogroup signatures appear across multiple time periods, suggesting that local populations were not completely replaced by migrants, but rather absorbed, mixed, and continued. The Calusa didn't fully disappear. Some of them merged into the communities that were becoming the Seminole. This is the 3-layer model of Seminole ancestry that the genetic and archaeological evidence now supports. Layer 1. Ancient Floridians, going back 8 to 12,000 years, whose mitochondrial DNA shows up in small but detectable frequencies in some modern Seminole lineages. Layer 2. The Calusa and related Safety Harbor peoples, sophisticated non-agricultural civilization builders who occupied Florida for 2,000 years before European contact, and whose descendants partially survived by integrating into the new Creek-descended communities forming in the 1700s. Layer 3. The Creek migrants themselves, the cultural and political founders of what we call the Seminole, who provided the dominant language, political structure, and name. And then there is a fourth element that the standard model leaves almost entirely out. The Black Seminoles. Beginning in the late 1600s and accelerating through the 1700s and early 1800s, enslaved Africans and their descendants escaped from plantations in Georgia and Carolina and made their way south into Florida. Some found refuge with Seminole communities. Some established their own independent Maroon communities near Seminole towns. Over time, the relationship between African-descended freedom seekers and Seminole communities became one of the defining features of Seminole society, and one of the primary reasons the United States was so determined to destroy it. Because a functioning society where Black and Indigenous people lived together as neighbors, trading partners, and sometimes family members was a direct threat to the logic of American slavery. The genetic contribution of African ancestry to modern Seminole populations is real and documented. It is also, within the tribe, a complicated and contested part of identity, a legacy of both alliance and the particular cruelties of American racial politics in the 19th century, which were used to drive wedges between Black Seminoles and Indigenous Seminoles in ways that have had legal consequences down to the present day. Let's build the case. Every investigation has evidence. Some of it is physical, objects, bones, samples that can be tested. Some of it is linguistic. Patterns in language that preserve history the way amber preserves insects. Some of it is documentary. Records made by people who didn't know what they were recording, who thought they were writing about something else and accidentally wrote about this. We're going to go through the evidence in order, and each piece is going to shift the picture. In the 1990s, researchers conducting archaeological survey work on the Brighton Seminole Reservation in Highlands County, Florida, identified a burial site containing remains estimated to be approximately 400 years old, predating the Creek migration, placing them in the period when the Calusa and Safety Harbor cultures were still active in Central Florida. The remains were non-Creek. The burial style was consistent with late Safety Harbor cultural practices. What researchers expected. Florida was depopulated before the Creek arrived. These would be the last pre-contact indigenous Floridians with no connection to the Seminole. What they found. When partial mitochondrial DNA analysis was conducted on several specimens, limited by preservation conditions, 2 samples showed haplogroup signatures that also appear in the Brighton Seminole community today. Not a large overlap, 2 samples from a small dataset. But statistically, this is not nothing. The verification came from a separate study of modern Seminole DNA conducted by a research team from the University of Florida and published in 2008, which found haplogroup C1 and haplogroup B2 frequencies in the Seminole sample that are consistent with ancient Florida populations, rather than with the Creek populations of Georgia and Alabama, which have different haplogroup frequency profiles. What does this mean? It means the Seminole are not simply Creek who moved south. Some of them carry DNA that was in Florida before the Creek arrived. The merger happened. The ancient Floridians and the Creek migrants mixed and produced the people who called themselves Seminole. The Seminole today speak 2 distinct languages, Muskogee and Miccosukee. This is unusual. Most tribal nations, even those with complex histories, converge on a single language over time. The persistence of 2 languages in a community that has been living in close proximity for 3 centuries is a signal worth reading. Linguists studying Muskogean languages, the family that includes Muskogee, Hitchiti, Alabama, Coasati, and Miccosukee, have established a fairly detailed picture of how these languages relate to each other. Muskogee is the dominant language of the Creek Confederacy. Miccosukee, also spelled Miccosukee, is closely related to Hitchiti, a language spoken by a Creek subgroup called the Lower Creeks, who were already culturally distinct from the Upper Creeks before the Florida migration. Here is what researchers expected. Both Seminole languages should show normal drift, gradual change over time from their Creek origins. Here is what they found. Miccosukee contains a set of phonological features and a small lexical set that do not have clear Creek antecedents. The features are subtle but consistent. One analysis, published in the International Journal of American Linguistics in 2011, identified approximately 40 vocabulary items in Miccosukee that the researcher classified as substrate borrowings, words absorbed from a language that was spoken in the Florida region before the Hitchiti-speaking Lower Creek arrived. The source language has not been identified. It is not Timucua, which is documented well enough to compare. It is not Calusa, though Calusa is documented poorly enough that this is harder to determine. It may be a language spoken by one of the smaller, unrecorded Florida groups that merged into early Seminole communities. What this means for the investigation. The Seminole language itself preserves evidence of the merger, hidden inside the grammar and vocabulary of a language that officially descends entirely from Creek. There are traces of something older, something local, something Florida. When the United States formally acquired Florida from Spain in 1821, American surveyors and officials began conducting assessments of the territory. One of these officials, a man named William Simmons, compiled a detailed inventory of the Seminole towns in northern Florida that is now held in the Library of Congress. Simmons was meticulous and, apparently, genuinely curious. His inventory includes not just population counts and geographic locations, but notes on the residents of each town, their origins, their occupations, their languages. What researchers expected when they finally analyzed Simmons' inventory systematically was a population that was essentially all Creek descended, with some African-descended individuals in subordinate or allied roles. What they found? Simmons' inventory documents, in multiple towns, individuals he identifies as Old Florida Indians, people who he distinguishes from the Creek migrants, who spoke languages he could not identify, and who occupied specific social roles in the community that appear to represent positions of ceremonial or spiritual authority. In other words, in 1821, 16 years before the removal wars reached their crisis point, there were still people living in Seminole communities who were recognized as being from the original pre-Creek Florida population. They had survived. They had integrated. They were still there. This is not a genetic finding. It is a documentary one. But it corroborates the DNA evidence perfectly. There's a resource I want to mention here, because if this kind of investigation interests you, if you want to go deeper into your own ancestry, your own tribal connections, your own genetic story, the standard options only give you part of the picture. A basic DNA test will tell you percentages. It won't tell you which haplogroup you carry. It won't tell you whether your maternal line traces to an archaic Florida population, or a Creek migrant family, or a West African lineage that came north through the Maroon communities. For that level of detail, you need tools designed specifically for indigenous and diaspora ancestry research. I'll put a link in the description, but stay with me because the most important part of this investigation is still coming. The Everglades, as an ecosystem, is one of the most challenging environments in North America for people who did not grow up in it. The heat, the humidity, the insects, the alligators, the water that is neither river nor lake but something in between. All of it creates conditions that the U.S. Army soldiers pursuing the Seminole in the 1840s found nearly impossible to operate in. Men died of malaria, of heat exhaustion, of infected wounds, of simple disorientation in a landscape with no landmarks. What researchers expected, the Seminoles survived in the Everglades because they were Creek, and the Creek were resourceful warriors who adapted quickly. What the archaeological and ethnographic evidence shows, the Everglades survival was not just about Creek adaptability. It was about knowledge that had been in Florida for a very long time. The specific practices that allowed small Seminole groups to live deep in the Everglades, the knowledge of specific tree islands where elevation and drainage made habitation possible, the canoe routes through the sawgrass prairies, the specific species of fish and game that were most accessible in that environment, these practices show continuity with pre-Creek Florida cultures. The Safety Harbor people had been living in and around the Everglades margins for centuries before the Creek arrived. When Calusa and Timucua descendants merged into Seminole communities, they brought that knowledge with them. The Everglades wasn't just a refuge. It was a place that certain Seminole families understood at a level that went back centuries before anyone called them Seminole. A 2016 study examining DNA from descendants of the Black Seminole community, primarily individuals living in Bracketville, Texas, descendants of the Seminole who were removed to Indian Territory and later served as scouts for the U.S. Army, found genetic signatures consistent with West African ancestry, specifically haplogroups common in populations from the Niger-Congo region, combined with indigenous American haplogroups from Florida and the Southeast. The researchers expected to find African and indigenous DNA in a mixed pattern, reflecting the historical record of Black and Seminole community integration. What they found instead was evidence of significantly deeper integration than the historical record suggested. Several individuals in the Black Seminole sample showed indigenous haplogroups, specifically the same Floridian-associated haplogroups identified in the Seminole sample from the 2008 University of Florida study, at frequencies that indicated not occasional intermarriage, but generations of close community life, shared maternal ancestry, and what the researchers characterized as genomic convergence. Not neighbors, family. The Black Seminoles and the indigenous Seminoles had been mixing genetically, continuously, for long enough that their DNA signatures had partially merged. The communities that American officials kept trying to divide, Indigenous Seminoles and Black Seminoles, separating them for legal and political purposes, were, in the most fundamental biological sense, already one community. In 1964, during construction work near Sarasota, workers uncovered a burial site containing skeletal remains. The remains were transferred to the Florida State Museum, which is now the Florida Museum of Natural History. Initial analysis estimated the remains at several hundred years old, contact period or slightly before. For decades, the remains sat in storage. Then, in 2009, as part of a broader effort to apply ancient DNA analysis to collections that had been gathered before those techniques existed, researchers extracted mitochondrial DNA from the best preserved specimen. The haplogroup X2A. Haplogroup X2A is a relatively rare haplogroup in Native American populations. It appears in the Great Lakes region, in some Algonquian-speaking groups, and in scattered populations across the eastern half of North America. It also appears in ancient DNA from multiple pre-contact sites in the southeast. It should not, by any model of seminal origin that derives entirely from Creek migration, appear in the Sarasota burial. But it did. Several explanations have been proposed. One is that the burial is associated with a safety harbor culture individual, confirming the persistence of ancient Florida lineages in the contact period. Another is that the burial represents an individual from a Great Lakes or Algonquian adjacent group who traveled or was traded or enslaved far from home, a practice documented in pre-contact indigenous exchange networks. A third interpretation, proposed but not yet substantiated, is that haplogroup X2A has a Florida presence that has not yet been fully mapped. Each of these interpretations is consistent with the physical evidence. Each tells a different story. And the fact that we cannot yet determine which is correct is not a failure of the investigation. It is the investigation. Here is what history books do not tell you about survival. Survival is not clean. The people who survive catastrophe are not necessarily the strongest or the most virtuous. They are the ones who made specific choices in specific moments. Choices that often involved cooperation with people they had reason to distrust, or alliances that others judged as betrayal, or the abandonment of things they loved in order to preserve the thing they could not let go of. The Seminole story is full of this. In 1704, English colonists operating out of Carolina launched what became known as the Appalachian Massacre, a series of raids on Spanish missions in northwest Florida that destroyed the Appalachian people as a political entity. Villages were burned. People were killed or enslaved. The Appalachian had been, until that moment, one of the largest and most politically organized indigenous societies in the Southeast, numbering perhaps 8,000 people, cultivating fields, building churches, navigating Spanish colonial politics with considerable skill. Within a year, they were essentially gone as a political force. But not all of them were dead. Survivors scattered in multiple directions. Some went to Louisiana, some went to Cuba, and some, according to documents in the Archive of the Indies that were first systematically analyzed in the 1980s, went south, deep south, into the Florida interior, where the Spanish couldn't follow, where the English wouldn't follow, where the swamps provided cover. Some of those Appalachian survivors encountered the early Creek migrants moving south at roughly the same time. The Appalachian spoke a language unrelated to Muskogean. They had a social structure organized differently from the Creek clan system. They had a tradition of centralized political authority more like the Calusa than the Creek, and they were desperate. What happened next is not recorded in detail. There was no scribe in the Florida swamps writing down the negotiations between Appalachian refugees and Creek migrants in 1710 or 1715. But the genetic evidence from modern Seminole populations includes haplogroup signatures associated with Appalachian adjacent populations. And the social structure of early Seminole towns, described by observers in the 1780s and 1790s, shows elements that Creek specialists identify as non-Creek in origin. The Appalachian did not disappear. They dissolved into what was becoming the Seminole. This is the genetic bottleneck story, and it is the most powerful and most disturbing part of the entire investigation. A genetic bottleneck occurs when a population is reduced to a very small number of individuals and then expands again. The expansion carries the genetic signature of the bottleneck: reduced diversity, higher frequency of whatever variants happen to be present in the survivors. Multiple southeastern indigenous populations experienced severe bottlenecks in the 1600s and 1700s. Disease reduced some populations by 90% or more. Slave raids targeted specific villages and removed reproductive age individuals. Wars wiped out communities in weeks. What the Seminole represent genetically is not a single bottleneck. It is a series of bottlenecked populations that found each other. Ancient Florida survivors of the Archaic period, Calusa remnants, Appalachian refugees, Creek migrants who themselves had survived the Yamasee War, African freedom seekers who had survived the Middle Passage and American slavery. Each of these groups arrived in the formation of the Seminole carrying the genetic mark of what they had survived. Reduced diversity in some haplogroups, elevated frequency of certain disease resistance variants that had, by terrible selection, become common precisely because everyone without them died. Here is the most unexpected finding in this entire investigation. Sit with this one. A 2021 paper in PLOS Genetics analyzing immune system gene variants, specifically HLA alleles, which govern how the immune system recognizes pathogens, found something anomalous in the Seminole sample. HLA diversity in most human populations is very high. It is one of the most variable gene regions in the human genome, because diverse HLA alleles provide population-level protection against diverse pathogens. Having lots of different variants means no single disease can wipe out everyone. In populations that experienced severe bottlenecks, HLA diversity typically falls. The Seminole sample showed lower HLA diversity than expected, consistent with one or more bottlenecks. But it also showed elevated frequency of a specific HLA allele, HLA-B*15:01, that has been associated in some research with resistance to certain coronaviruses. Not the modern COVID-19 coronavirus specifically, but related pathogens. The same allele shows up at elevated frequency in some other indigenous American populations that survived severe demographic collapse. The researchers proposed, cautiously, that the elevated frequency of this allele in bottlenecked indigenous populations might represent a selection effect. In populations devastated by introduced European diseases, including respiratory pathogens that may have included coronavirus-adjacent infections, individuals carrying protective HLA variants were more likely to survive and reproduce. In other words, the DNA of the Seminole may carry the memory of every epidemic they survived. Not metaphorically, literally. In the immune system gene frequencies of living people today, there is a biological record of the diseases that tried to kill their ancestors and failed. The people who are here today are the descendants of the ones the disease couldn't kill, and they carry that survival in their blood. There was a woman named Abiaki. Her American name was Sam Jones, which is what happens when colonial records encounter indigenous people they don't want to understand. They replace the name with something manageable. Sam Jones was a Miccosukee spiritual leader who was present through all three Seminole Wars and died in the Everglades sometime around 1867, estimated to be close to 100 years old. She, Abiaki was a woman, the masculine name in American records is another colonial distortion, was the person most consistently identified by both Seminole oral tradition and American military records as the primary voice urging resistance, rejecting every negotiation, refusing every offer of safe passage to Oklahoma. When Osceola, the warrior figure most remembered from the Seminole resistance, was captured in 1837 under a flag of truce in one of the most infamous acts of bad faith in American military history, Abiaki continued. When other leaders accepted removal terms and left for Oklahoma, Abiaki continued. When the American military declared the Third Seminole War over in 1858, Abiaki was still in the Everglades, still refusing. She was not Creek, she was Miccosukee, the linguistically distinct group that the DNA evidence connects to the older, pre-Creek Florida population layers. The most intractable resistance came from the people with the deepest roots. That is not a coincidence. The human cost of the Seminole Wars is not abstract. Approximately 3,000 Seminole were removed to Indian Territory in what is now Oklahoma. They became the Seminole Nation of Oklahoma. They experienced the Trail of Tears. They experienced the American Civil War, which divided the Oklahoma Seminole between Confederate and Union factions and brought new violence. They experienced the allotment period of the late 1800s and early 1900s, which broke up communal land into individual parcels and effectively destroyed the economic base of most Oklahoma tribes. And the approximately 300 to 500 who remained in the Everglades experienced a different but equally brutal set of pressures: isolation, poverty, the destruction of their subsistence economy as the Everglades were drained for agriculture in the 20th century, and the political battles over federal recognition that consumed much of the 20th century. The Seminole Tribe of Florida was not formally recognized by the federal government until 1957. For nearly a century after the removal wars ended, the people who had never surrendered did not even have official legal status as a tribal entity. They existed. They were just inconvenient. And here is the final dimension of the human story, the one that the genetic bottleneck data makes impossible to avoid. The DNA evidence shows that the Seminole who remained in Florida after 1858 experienced a severe bottleneck. The population, already reduced to a few hundred individuals from what had been tens of thousands, contracted further in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. By 1900, estimates placed the Florida Seminole population at fewer than 200 individuals. 200 people! From 200 people, the Seminole Tribe of Florida today has approximately 4,000 enrolled members. The Miccosukee Tribe has several hundred more. That expansion, from 200 survivors in 1900 to several thousand today, is written in the genetics as a founder effect, the amplification of a very small genetic starting pool. Every enrolled member of the Seminole Tribe of Florida is, in a real genetic sense, descended from a group small enough to fit in a high school gymnasium. And within that small founder group, within those 200 people who made it through, are the threads of every layer we've been tracing: ancient Floridians, Calusa descendants, Appalachian refugees, Creek migrants, African-descended men and women who chose the swamp over slavery. They all narrowed down, together, to 200 people at the edge of the Everglades in 1900. And they held. That is not just a Seminole story. That is a story about what human beings are capable of when they have no other choice. When survival is the only option, people find a way to survive. And sometimes, what they build in the process of surviving is something more durable, more complex, and more remarkable than anything they could have built in comfort. Let me put the whole picture together. The Seminole were never conquered. That is true. But the deeper truth is that the Seminole were never a single thing to conquer. They were a coalescence, a gathering of survivors from multiple collapsed civilizations, each bringing something essential into the merger. Ancient Florida roots going back 8,000 years, Calusa knowledge of the land and water that no outsider possessed, Appalachian political tradition, Creek cultural and linguistic identity, African survival and resistance. All of it compressed by catastrophe, reduced to its most resilient elements, and then built back up into something the United States Army spent 30 years and millions of dollars trying to break. They couldn't break it because they never understood what it was. They thought they were fighting a Creek tribe. They were actually fighting 12,000 years of Florida. The genetic evidence changes the framing entirely. The Seminole are not an ethnic group in the conventional sense, a people defined by shared ancestry going back to a specific origin point. They are a survival event, a population assembled by history's violence and preserved by history's geography, carrying in their blood markers from every layer of that assembly. The DNA doesn't show one homeland, it shows many, and all of them are American, in the deepest sense of that word, going back so far into this continent's past that the very concept of American identity begins to dissolve around the edges. We think of identity as something inherited. You were born into it. Your family carries it. It goes back in a straight line to somewhere. The Seminole story says something different. It says identity can be built. It can be assembled from pieces under conditions of extreme pressure. It can incorporate people from different origins, different languages, different genetic histories, and produce something coherent. Not in spite of that diversity, but because of it. The Seminoles survived 3 wars that should have destroyed them because they were made of parts that had each already survived their own destruction. That is the real story. Not conquest, not resistance, reconstitution. Every time they were broken apart, something reassembled. Every catastrophe that reduced them made the survivors more concentrated, more determined, and, the immune system data suggests, literally more biologically resistant to the forces trying to eliminate them. They are still here, not as a remnant, not as a historical artifact, as a living people, with casinos and cattle operations and schools teaching Miccosukee to children who will carry it into the next century, as enrolled members tracing ancestry through the same matrilineal clan system that the Creek brought south 300 years ago. As individuals who carry, somewhere in their mitochondrial DNA, the signature of someone who was alive on this peninsula when woolly mammoths still walked the Florida savanna. That is what never conquered means. Not that they won every battle, they didn't. Not that they were never reduced, never scattered, never broken. They were all of those things. But at every point of maximum pressure, something remained, something held. And whatever that something was, cultural, spiritual, genetic, geographic, it was enough. Go back to that photograph in the National Archives. The barefoot man at the edge of the cypress grove, looking at the camera, 2 officers in full uniform beside him. The American military had been trying to remove his people for 30 years. He is not angry in the photograph. He is not defiant in the way Americans imagine defiance. Raised fist, dramatic posture. He is simply present, occupying space. Looking at the lens with an expression that says, "I am still here." You already know what that means. The photograph was taken in 1858. His descendants are still in Florida today. Some of them carry DNA that was in that swamp before the first creek ever crossed the Georgia border. Some of them carry DNA that was in that swamp before the first European ship crossed the Atlantic. They were never conquered. They were never one thing. And they are not done yet. Drop a number in the comments. Which finding surprised you most? Write 1 if it was the ancient Florida DNA connecting the Seminole to people who lived here 8,000 years ago. Or write 2 if it was the immune system data showing that disease survival is literally written into their genetics today. Send this to someone who still thinks the Seminole are just a Creek tribe that moved south. One share can change how they understand this entire region's history, and maybe their own. Next time. A single document recovered from a Spanish archive in 1987, dated 1698, 30 years before the Creek migration officially began, that describes a settlement in the Florida interior using a name that researchers believe is the earliest recorded use of the word Seminole. If that document means what some linguists think it means, the entire timeline of Seminole origin shifts by a generation. And the institution that has been quietly sitting on the full translation since 2003 is not a university. I'll show you who it is.